Let's talk about sexual orientation. We'll start with working to understand what this aspect of identity is actually about. Then we'll go over some vocab, and finally we'll look at the standard construction of sexual orientation categories and whether the gender binary shows up here too. Spoiler, it does! Okay, so let's start with just a basic definition. Sexual orientation refers to who someone is sexually, romantically, or emotionally into. Okay, but how do we know who a person is sexually, romantically, or emotionally into? What indicates what a person's sexual orientation is? So, generally speaking, we think that sexual orientation is based on desires or dispositions. It's about who you're sexually or romantically attracted to or oriented towards. Just as gender is about one's internal sense of one's own identity, sexual orientation is about one's internal desires or dispositions. Generally, these desires or dispositions are presumed to be at least somewhat stable for them to be considered part of one's sexual orientation identity. So if you have like one fleeting moment of attraction towards someone of a gender or sex other than what you're normally attracted towards, that's generally not going to call for a whole reevaluation of your sexual orientation, although it could. So instead, the desires that comprise one's sexual orientation are ones that are at least somewhat stable and reliable. But crucially, that doesn't mean that one's sexual orientation has to be just totally rigid or unchanging. These things can change or evolve over time, or we might start to recognize desires that we previously hadn't paid much attention to. However, while a person's sexual desires might sometimes change over time, that doesn't mean that a person or anyone else can just decide to change their sexual orientation. That's just not how anything works. And yet, there's this very long history of trying to intervene on and alter the sexual orientations of folks who are not or aren't presumed to be straight. So most recently, we've seen this with the practice of what's called gay conversion therapy, in which folks are exposed to or required to watch sexualized images of, it's usually like gay porn, and are exposed to things like electric shock or other kinds of negative sensory stimulation in an attempt to instill a kind of avoidance response, and on the basis of that, alter what a person's sexual orientation is. This practice has been legally classified as child abuse in 25 states in the United States as of June 2021. It is illegal in 25 states, but that means that it is legal. This can legally be done to children, to minors, in 25 states. Even in the places that have banned this practice from being performed on children, it's legal everywhere to perform on adults, so long as the adults sign up for it. There can be a lot of reasons why somebody might be pressured or socially pressured into agreeing to go to one of these centers. And also, even in the states where it has been legally classified as child abuse, it is still permitted to be practiced by religious institutions. There is no evidence that shows that sexual orientation or gender, because now this is being enacted on trans folks, there is no evidence that shows that this practice works or that there is any other practice that could simply change what somebody's sexual orientation is. There's just no evidence that this is how anything works. And there's a great deal of evidence that this is not how it works. And yet, these organizations continue forward. So I often hear folks saying that homophobia is a thing of the past and that the world has significantly changed. And I think it's important to recognize the changes that have happened. And at the same time, it's important to recognize the practices that are still occurring. Okay, so Sexual orientation is based on a person's internal desires or dispositions in terms of who they are sexually or romantically attracted to. Sometimes people do a kind of gatekeeping and say that one doesn't really have a particular sexual orientation if they haven't, or if they currently aren't, having sexual interactions with folks of the particular associated gender. But one needn't act on an attraction to have that attraction. And there can be lots of reasons why someone may or may not engage in particular sexual behavior or interactions. So maybe they're sexually active because of peer pressure, and who they're sexually active with isn't really a reflection of who they might feel desire towards. There's a great deal of peer pressure, especially in like high school or college, my goodness. Maybe the person is in an environment where it would be risky or dangerous to come out if they aren't straight. Would we really want to say that only folks who are privileged to be in a safe environment get to be gay or bi? That strikes me as a not great road to go down. This kind of gatekeeping is often used, intentionally or not, to reinforce what's called compulsory heterosexuality. This is the social assumption and strong social pressure that everyone is and should be straight. So straight folks are rarely told, for example, if they're a man, "Are you really straight? You haven't had sex with a woman yet, so how would you know?" But folks who aren't straight often do receive this kind of gatekeeping message from both straight and queer communities. And that serves as a way to try and force folks to stay in that category of being classified as straight, even if those aren't what the person's sets of desires or attractions would classify them as being. Moreover, it'd be odd and verging on incomprehensible if we really believed that one doesn't have a sexual orientation until after engaging in sexual activities with someone of the associated identity, right? So it'd mean that you in fact don't have a sexual orientation until after you've hooked up with someone for the first time. Which raises the question of what would direct you towards that person in the first place if you do not yet have a sexual orientation. And then, still based on this, once you hook up with someone, then your sexual orientation would be just entirely based on who you happen to hook up with, which again, if we think you didn't yet have a sexual orientation before hooking up, it's unclear what would have led to or structured that particular kind of sexual encounter. So if we really truly believed that sexual orientation were fully just determined by one's behavior, then it would be literally impossible to have a process of figuring out your sexual orientation, because it would be just completely and totally based on what sexual encounters one has had. And that doesn't seem right. Okay, so once again, sexual orientation is based on a person's internal desires or dispositions in terms of who they're sexually or romantically attracted to. Okay. Next, we can start to look at what sexual orientation is directed at. Is it that folks are interested in people based on their biological sex? Based on their gender? Is it about both? Let's try and figure it out. So first of all, we might look at whether sexual orientation is directed at folks based on their biological sex identity. Might seem plausible. But as we know, you can't always know what a person's chromosomes or internal reproductive organs are, or whatever it is that we might think biological sex is actually about. So we usually don't have the information to really know what someone's sex identity actually is. Okay, so maybe a sexual orientation directed at folks on the basis of gender? That seems at least a little bit more plausible, since it at least has something to do with a person's social positioning. But think about media for a moment, any kind of media. We see these images of folks and one might say oh, she's super hot, I'm into her. But the people we see on social media, in advertising, in movies and on TV, we don't actually know anything about their gender. We have no way of knowing their internal sense of their own identity. All that that kind of attraction is based on, all that it can be based on, is something about appearance. Okay, so it seems like sexual orientation isn't directed at folks on either a simplistic understanding of sex or of gender. So it's not clear or straightforward. Sari Van Anders, when writing about sexual configuration theory, which we'll get into next, argues that sexual orientation is directed at a person's gender sex, the interconnected categories of gender and sex. Robin Denroff identifies specific components of gender sex and argues that sexual orientation is directed at a person's body and/or their gender expression. So we needn't say that sexual orientation is directed at the totality of someone's sex identity or gender identity, if those two things are even separable, but rather that it's directed at a person's body and/or their gender expression. Maybe it even varies. It might be the case that one experiences attraction towards folks who we don't know well on the basis of their body and/or gender expression, and that as we do get to know someone more, that attraction might deepen or extend to also be directed at their gender, something more robustly connected to their own identity. Okay, so sexual orientation is, based on a person's internal sense of attraction or desires, who it is that they are attracted to. And we tend to be attracted to folks on the basis of something about bodies or gender expression, or perhaps if one has this information, perhaps something about one's gender identity. Now, importantly, the standard construction of sexual orientation conceives of it as a relational identity. One's sexual orientation is determined on the basis of who one is sexually, romantically, or emotionally attracted to in relation to one's own identity. So it's a two-party kind of identity category. It's not just based on what's going on with you. It's also based on the identities of the folks one is sexually, romantically, or emotionally attracted to. Okay, so let's go through some sexual orientation terms to make this a little bit clearer, and then we'll dig into it more. Straight refers to a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the opposite gender/sex. Now, note the presumption there that there are two and only two gender-sex categories that are in opposition to one another. Sometimes people learn the terms heterosexual and homosexual as a way to sort of more, maybe officially describe sexual orientation. But I want us to pause on that term before we keep going forward. So heterosexual, and by extension homosexual, both emerge out of a long history of pathologizing and institutionalizing people who weren't who weren't thought to be straight. So even though sometimes we treat this as if it's a more neutral or more official term, it's worth noting that this term is both rooted in and reinforces this whole ideology in which anyone whose sexual orientation is not that of being straight are treated as deviant or in need of a medical diagnosis and treatment. Gay refers to a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender sex. Historically, this primarily referred to men, but today it can refer to both men and women. Notice which identities I just mentioned right there. Now, as I talked about on the previous slide, oftentimes people learn the term homosexual as a more, official sounding or neutral term. Yet this term, just like heterosexual, is rooted in a whole history of pathologizing and institutionalizing people who weren't or who weren't thought to be straight. Once again, it's worth thinking about what it is that the terms we use are doing. Bisexual, or bi, refers to a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of more than one gender sex. The frequency, intensity, or quality of attraction is not necessarily directed towards the genders or sexes equally. Now, this is actually really important, that bisexuality does not need to be 50-50 or the exact same. There are some folks who enjoy, maybe romantic encounters with folks of one gender, but are especially sexually interested in folks of another gender. So it's worth recognizing that bisexuality doesn't have to be split 50-50. It's also worth recognizing that if somebody is bi and enters into a relationship with someone, of a different gender sex than their own, that does not suddenly make them straight. The same sets of attraction or desire for a variety of different genders and sexes are still there. They're just in a relationship with one person. This kind of bisexual erasure, however, is fairly commonplace, and it's worth recognizing and hopefully pushing back against. Pansexual, or pan, refers to a person for whom gender or sex does not play a significant role in who they are emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to. Now, notice that whereas bisexuality involves being attracted to more than one gender or sex, pansexuality involves being attracted to folks regardless of what their gender or sex is. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that gender or sex don't play any role whatsoever in that attraction, but rather the attraction is based on, other components of identity, or maybe the totality of them as a person, rather than, at least starting off, on the basis of the person's gender or sex identity. Okay, now, queer refers to a person whose sexual or gender identity doesn't fit into traditional binary categories, or someone who rejects heteronormative identity categories. This can be an umbrella term or a standalone identity that embraces just a matrix of non-normative sexual preferences, orientations, and habits. I'll note right here that the word queer was, especially in the 60s through early 2000s, a particularly hateful derogatory term that was hurled against anyone who was gay or trans or presumed to have a non-normative identity. However, this term went through a really robust reclamation process. And today is an identity category that a lot of folks both use and label ourselves with pride. It tends to vary a little bit by, maybe age and geographic region, whether people tend to use this term a lot or not. It's particularly common amongst younger folks today because, as we will see, of the ways that it doesn't require these sorts of binary categories. Finally, the term asexual refers to a person who does not experience sexual attraction to others. I'm going to go into this term and talking about both asexuality and aromanticism in much more detail elsewhere. Here, I'm going to simply note that depending on whether the person experiences romantic attraction to others, asexuality can either be a sexual orientation identity or it can be a sexual attraction identity. And I'll talk about that difference a little bit more in another video. Let's look at the construction of these categories and how the gender binary fits in. So notice how the most well-recognized of these categories, gay and straight, assume that there are such things as the same and opposite genders. What does that mean? What does it mean to have the same gender as somebody else? That is something that's only conceptually coherent if we believe that there are these gender categories. Similarly, it's only coherent to say that there are such things as the opposite gender if we believe that there are two genders that are opposites of one another. Notice also how this framework doesn't have space for folks who are non-binary or gender expansive. So if somebody is non-binary and gay, does that mean they're only into other non-binary folks? It's not what gay is standardly taken to mean. Similarly, if somebody is, say, a woman and is straight, the expectation isn't that she's into non-binary folks, even though non-binary is a gender other than her own. So the standard construction of sexual orientation presumes that everyone has a binary sex and or gender, so that people can be understood to be the same sex or gender, that there are two genders or sexes that are opposite to each other, that one's binary gender or sex will stay the same throughout the entirety of a person's life, and that the people one's into also have a gender or sex that is unchanging. But those assumptions just don't always hold up or track the reality of everyone's identities. Let's go back to this idea that sexual orientation, at least in the standard construction of it, is a relational identity. And even more specifically, it's a two-party identity. That means that one's sexual orientation is based both on the identities of who one is into, as well as your own identity. That means that if the identities of either party change, then your sexual orientation might change as well. And that's really, we don't have any other identity categories that work quite like that. So let's explore this for a moment. So let's see here. If somebody is, if they have understood themselves up until this point to be gay and a woman, but then at some point realizes that, nope, actually they're a man, does that mean that he's also now straight? He's still into the exact same people as before. Nothing about his sexual desires or dispositions has actually shifted or changed. It's odd that his sexual orientation gets reclassified, even though, again, it is the exact same set of desires directed towards the exact same group of people. The thing that's changed is his own gender, his own understanding of his identity. It's worth thinking about how this category of sexual orientation has standardly been constructed in the way that it relies on the components of both your own identity as well as the identities of the folks you're into. So let's do another one. If someone is a straight woman and has been in a long-term relationship and their partner comes out as non-binary, does that mean that the woman's sexual orientation has to change too? Right? So she's still into her partner. Yay for the partner, right? So still into the exact same person. But her partner, as we now know, is non-binary, is not, in fact, a man, as both people had sort of been presuming for a little while. So her partner's identity has changed in terms of her partner's gender. But this woman's sexual orientation also seems like it is, in need of reclassification. And that seems odd. Nothing about her own, sets of desires or dispositions, nothing about her own gender has changed. Still into the exact same, both set of people more broadly, still in a relationship with the exact same person. It's weird that her sexual orientation seems like it needs to change right here. At the same time, it would be a pretty shitty form of both denial and erasure of her partner's identity if she continued to identify as straight, right? So that would somehow imply that her partner isn't really non-binary. And that would be, like a pretty shitty thing to do to her partner. So there are good reasons why her sexual orientation should be reclassified here. But it's also weird that the way that this category has historically or standardly been constructed means that if one gets new information about other people's identities, it can change your own as well. It's worth thinking about how we have standardly constructed this category and whether it necessarily has to be constructed this way, or if there are other alternatives. So it's worth noting right here that the categories of bi, pan, and queer aren't the same kind of two-party identity categories that the categories of gay and straight are. For both the categories of bi, pan, and queer, if one person or another person's identity is either re-understood or if it shifts or changes throughout time, that doesn't necessarily require that the folks they are in sexual or romantic either relationships or having interactions with doesn't necessarily require that folks re-understand their sexual orientations as well. Whew. Okay, so Dembroff argues that another possibility for thinking about sexual orientation might be thinking about just who one is attracted to or oriented towards without involving the component of your own identity. Okay, so under Dembroff's framework, we might group together everyone who is sexually attracted to women, and we might group together everyone who is sexually attracted to men. Or we might group together everyone who is, sexually attracted to folks of a variety of genders. This is one possible way that we could organize sexual orientation categories in a way that creates more space for gender fluidity and also that doesn't, involve such very complicated metaphysics in the way that our current understandings of sexual orientation tend to. Another possibility in this same vein is to think of sexual orientation along the categories of monosexuality, which refers to folks who are primarily or only sexually or romantically attracted to folks of one sex or gender, regardless of what it is, and folks who are non-monosexual, which refers to folks who are attracted to more than one sex and or gender. Right? So there are a variety of different ways that we could be carving up our categories of sexual orientation. And it's not clear that the metaphysics of our standard conceptions of sexual orientation create space or allow for a more robust understanding of categories such as gender, sex, or gender sex.